pivot to the film's cultural politics now. It would be suitable to preface this discussion with the understanding that in certain ways, Hollywood symbolically functions as a nation-state, instilling ideologies, even feelings amongst its followers, and that in assuming its role as a metaphorical nation-state, it potentially follows the tasks of providing images, stirring feelings, and relating stories that convey and ensure a sense of unity. Since this idea follows along the lines of cultural/media imperialism, Apocalypse Now could be considered to be a facilitator of Coppola's attempt to create a narrative and visuals that represent his notions or ideals behind a historical significant event, involving two countries of vastly different cultures, the United States and Vietnam. Coppola's views might be slightly radical, or he might be straying away from the conventions of certain filmatic portrayals, such as those that typically glorify war and violence. However, since his project involves greater capital influence and attention, like several Hollywood blockbusters do, it contains the privilege of having the upper hand and the ability to spread certain ideals. For instance, an independent filmmaker in Vietnam who wishes to portray the Vietnamese perspective, and may necessarily lack because of limited global exposure. In this way, Hollywood and big-budget films like Apocalypse Now succeed in dominating film screens around the world to impose their own ideas on political discourse and the retelling of a shared history. To support this argument, one could consider that firstly, the global domination of the American film industry exemplifies one of the major criticisms of cultural globalizations due to its potential homogenizing effect of global culture. And second, that Hollywood's mammoth position in the world film market is a threat to the flourishing diversity of international cinema. And thirdly, to retaliate and push against the Americanizing force, several other countries' governments have spent large sums of money to maintain presence in the film industry, indicating films are perceived as having considerable symbolic and cultural value. This perhaps has more to do with the factors within distribution rather than how much each country is capable of producing. For the market share of domestic films in the United States, it's always been over 90%. And that it's not possible to see any foreign films within the American theaters. If the United States, as a hegemonic power, dominates the area of film distribution economically, mass distribute their own products to other countries, and do not open enough channels for others to display their work in the United States, cultural imperialism and cultural erasure are bound to affect the visibility of other cultures. As can be understood in the context of Apocalypse Now, it gained a significant amount of revenue in its first 16 weeks from countries outside of the United States, which it achieves even though it rarely features any stars, cultures, or ideals of those countries. Armand Matlart addresses this notion, or rather this fear, in detail too. In taking steps to protect their own industries, not only did other countries invest more money, they also took political actions for the sake of their national cinemas. For instance, the Weimar Republic renewed the imperial decision to limit the import of US films. As was mentioned earlier, while United Artists paid $7 million to distribute Apocalypse Now domestically, the exact same amount was paid by the international distributors to claim their territorial rights for the film. These distributors paid to only increase the visibility of an American film because the understanding was that American films were popular and desired in those countries, especially those coming from the likes of Francis Ford Coppola. However, that could be considered taking on the political economy approach, one that rather leans on analyzing the question of power, hegemony, and control, and dealing with ownership of production as well as social and economic power relations. Conversely, looking at this from the cultural globalization approach might present a diverging perspective on the topic, one that might refute the cultural imperialism theory in its context. Matlard explains that cultural firms in other countries are not only admitting and consuming Western cultures, but also developing hybrid cultures that by mixing two different cultures between local and global, and eventually penetrate other countries, including the United States. While this may or may not apply to Apocalypse Now's exhibition, it certainly can be seen in conjunction to its production process. As mentioned earlier in the film, while Australia and the United States refused Coppola and the permission to film within locations in the country, the government of the Philippines was more than accommodating to their request, and even provided some of their military resources for the process. While the Philippines is not necessarily embedded in the discourse of the film, this gesture certainly paints the pictures of the Philippines as a nation that it is welcoming to other nations instead of being restrictive, such as closing channels for distribution and to enrich their cultural production. This may open the Philippines as a potential budding market for scouting, set, and accessible locations. Such an action would also help portray the Philippines as a resourceful and abundant region when it comes to filming locations, and by this virtue, the benefits of this exchange are two-sided and equal, as opposed to, for instance, the United States benefiting for exporting most of their films and not importing as much in return. Now here's our conclusion. The massive success of films such as Apocalypse Now and others like it perhaps have been propagating this fear for the duration that the United States reigned over the global film market due to its high export and low import of movies. However, while data regarding exhibition and distribution may certainly paint this picture, it is important to note that several countries have been significantly enriched their economies by a growth in production, namely as centers and locations for production, shooting, etc., and have attempted to embrace the notion of hybridity. However, a notion that is gradually dissipating now, but which rather emerged in the 20th century, was the dominance Hollywood had economically and ideologically over other countries, and which allowed films like Apocalypse Now to generate large budgets and larger revenues despite error, constant losses, and uncertainties during the timeline of the project. In conclusion, by virtue of being an American Hollywood film, Apocalypse Now has the power to establish itself and reap benefits worldwide through a push of capital and global influence.